Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. The good news is that the lockdown in Plateau State has been lifted. So in the coming days and weeks and months, we are going to be having more outdoor content. So stay tuned. And in line with that, I actually saw this fact online. According to researchers at the National Institute for Health Research, fast walkers tend to live longer than slow walkers. So now that the lockdown has been lifted, you might want to pick up the pace, to extend your lifespan. So today we are going to be talking about frame rate for video. There are two very popular standards, NTSC and PAL. In the NTSC you have 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 60, 120 and above. Whereas in the PAL system you have 25 and 50 frames per second. Now NTSC is used mostly in the United States and PAL is used in Europe and most other parts of the world. But 24 frames per second has been agreed as the most cinematic frame rate to use for your video. So generally all over the world, filmmakers, videographers use 24 frames per second. So when we're talking about frame rate, simply put, is the number of still frames that is shown to you, the viewer, per second. So if you are shooting at 24 frames per second, that is 24 still frames will give you 1 second. So if you go to your editing timeline in Premiere Pro, DaVinci or Final Cut or whatever it is you're using to edit, after every 24 frames you have 1 second. Same thing applies to 30, 60, 120 and others. So you might be wondering why we have so many different frame rates. Actually, not a lot of cameras shoot real 24 frames per second. They shoot 23.97. There's like 0.1% less than the actual frame rate. Although there are cameras like Red that shoots real 24 frames per second, and at this point it depends on what your client wants. If your client wants real 24 frames per second, you can give it to them, but generally across the board 24 frames per second is 0.1 less. Same thing applies to 60 and 120 and the other frame rates. So 24 frames per second has been agreed to be the cinematic frame rate. So when you are shooting real time, you're shooting wedding films, you're shooting travel videos, you're shooting occasions, you're shooting interviews, 24 frames per second is usually the frame of choice. 30 frames per second is used for broadcast. So whatever you're going to have, like on a reality TV show, what's going to be shown on TV, 30 frames per second is the standard for that. 60 frames per second is where it begins to get really interesting and where you begin to get creative with your choices. 60 frames per second is used in two scenarios. Number one, if you're shooting very fast-paced actions. Let's say you're shooting sports, car racing, football, basketball and the likes. You want 60 frames per second, and why you want that is because the more frames you have, the more you can see in a single second. So as the players are running across the pitch, you can get them more detailed in every single second of capture. The second scenario where you want to shoot 60 frames per second and higher frame rate is when you are shooting slow motion. Now I use a lot of 60 frames per second in my travel videos or when I'm shooting B-roll, as you can see on other videos in my channel. This is very good and it comes in very handy. You put that in 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second and you immediately have a smooth B-roll to work with. Now when you put a 60 frames per second video on a 24 frames per second timeline in your editing timeline, you are able to slow it down by 40%, and 120 frames per second you're able to slow it down up to 20%. So you have a lot of leeway to be creative with your shots, and I've demonstrated it with this simple sequence. Right now you are looking at this drink pouring in 24 frames per second. It doesn't look anything spectacular, it doesn't look anything fancy, it's just real time. But when we move on to 60 frames per second, you can immediately see that it looks so much better, and that's because this is a 60 frames per second video conformed to 24, so it has been slowed down by 40%. But when we take it a notch higher and we'll go into 120 frames per second, this looks amazing because we have slowed down this clip all the way to 20%. If you would like me to make a video on how you can slow down your clips in a 24 frames per second timeline, then let me know in the comment section below. Now, whenever you are selecting your frame rate, it affects your shutter speed in video. The rule is this: whatever frame rate you are shooting, your shutter speed has to be double that. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you want your shutter speed to be 1/48 of a second. But most cameras don't have 1/48 of a second, so you can get by with 1/58 of a second. If you're shooting with 30 frames per second, then 1/68 of a second. Then you get the point. It goes on and on like that. Now, if you have a cinema camera that measures in angles instead of shutter speed, if you just put your shutter angle to 180 degrees, then whatever frame rate you choose, the camera will automatically compensate for that. But that is only for cameras that measure in shutter angles instead of shutter speed. So we have like the GH4, like the GH5, like cinema cameras like the Blackmagic Pocket 4K, 6K, and other cinema cameras. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you found it useful. If you did find it useful, let me know in the comment section below. Don't forget to subscribe because we have so much more goodies coming on the way. And like I said, we're going to be going out more often now that the lockdown is over in my state. And I'll see you in the next video. See ya. Same thing applies to 30, 60, 120. So if you're talking about frame rate, simply is the number of frames that is